Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some layered dimension cards using the new Tunnelscapes collection from Spellbinders. These are some great collections that have a bunch of different ways that you can use them. So there's the rainbow slice here. There is the tunnel clouds here, and I love the fact that each one of these has some extra different dies that you can use in different ways. This one here works really well with the tunnel clouds. You can create some fun vacation or travel themed cards. This one here is the underwater tunnelscapes, and it has a layered anchor as well as some seaweed and coral. This one works as well with the underwater tunnelscapes. It's the perched birds, and I love the layers that you get from those birds. This one is some different underwater creatures to go with the underwater tunnelscapes. And of course, I love it when collections have stamp sets that have stamps that work perfectly with those dies. So for my first card, I'm going to start out with the tunnel clouds, and I'm going to create my favorite galaxy background. So I'm using a Tombow brush set. Tombow markers are dye-based markers, and this one is some perfect color combinations to go and create a galaxy theme. So I have some mixed media cardstock here that I'm using these dye-based markers on, and I'm just scribbling bits of color. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the galaxy themed marker set. It just makes it easy for color choice. You can choose whatever ones you want for your galaxy background. I would suggest blues, pinks. There's a little bit of green in here, some purples, and then there's also a black pen. Now you could also do the same technique with dye-based ink pads, just putting a little bit of ink in different areas. And then I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to spray it liberally with water. Now I like to spray my surface that I'm working on as well as the backside of the piece, because by having water on the backside as well as the front side, you're not going to get it curling as it's trying to dry. It does take a lot longer to dry this way though, because it's more saturated, but by having it lay nice and flat while it's drying and not curling, you're not going to get the ink streaking down and creating lines. Now, this particular one created a little bit of a ring around it when it was drying. That's okay. It's going to be covered with the clouds anyways, but even if it wasn't, you can just do ink blending like this in order to cover it. So I'm starting with some Chip Sapphire Distress ink, and then I end up going to black just to darken it just a little bit. Now I'm also going to use a little bit of these ink colors on the center just to tone down a few of the brighter colors. You can have it as bright or as toned down as you want, and by combining the ink background with ink blending, you can have a little bit more control. I love doing this background for a galaxy look. You can also get a very similar look with the Northern Lights by just changing the way you're using your markers. Now, the one thing you don't have any control over is how everything blends and bleeds while it's wet, but that's part of the fun of this background, is seeing what this does while it's drying and what it creates. And I've never created a background yet that I haven't absolutely loved. So I'm taking my background here. This one is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm taking my pieces that I'm going to use the tunnel cloud dies on, and I'm cutting them down a little bit. So I have some Indigo cardstock here, and I cut it down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And then I'm taking some Cosmic Sky cardstock here, and I'm cutting it to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So my mats here are going to have an eighth of an inch difference between them, but they're going to create the look of a mat around the outside as well as the different colors on the inside. So this Tunnel Clouds die set has 3 different dies that you can use for the clouds. I'm actually only using 2 of them because I want to have my opening in my clouds a little bit bigger. I want to be able to see that background that we just created with those markers. So by having the larger of the 2 backgrounds there, I can make sure that I get a lot of, I can see a lot of that background. So once I have those pieces placed on my cardstock, I've got them taped in place just to make sure they're not going to move on me. I can put them through my die cutting machine and cut out those pieces. Now for this particular card, I wasn't really picky on how the clouds were going to lay, so I die cut both of them at the same time. If you wanted to have a little bit more control over how those clouds were going to lay, what you could do is die cut the larger one, place it over the cardstock you wanted for the smaller one, and then place your die or position your die to make sure that you have the look that you're going for. I knew no matter how I had these clouds, I was going to like the way it looked, so I didn't really need to worry. And the other thing too is once these are ready, you can just turn them 180 degrees if you wanted to position them just a little bit different. Now I wanted a little bit of a white highlight on the inside of my die cuts, so I took some white pigment ink and did just a little bit of light ink blending there. And by doing that, I get a light highlight and some visual dimension. Next, I'm going to take some splatter white paint and I'm going to put some splatters on my galaxy background to create the look of stars. Now you can see a little bit of brown on the top. While this white pigment sits, it does separate just a tiny little bit and have that brown on the top. You can just mix it right back in, take a little bit of paint out from there and mix it with a little bit of water to loosen it up a little bit. Gather some on your brush and then tap it on another brush or onto a pencil or some scissors in order to create that splatter. You could also use a splatter brush if you wanted a little bit more of an all-around non-directional splatter. I didn't have enough paint on my surface here in order for it to gather up in my splatter brush, and my other brush was doing just fine with it. So it's really a matter of what you prefer when you're creating your splatter. I'm just creating a really fine splatter here. I don't want large droplets. I want nice and fine mist there. That is the look of the card before we start to put it together. I took some of the stars from the die set and I cut it out of some holographic cardstock. This was actually cardstock that had the prism foil from doing a negative foil. And I love to save my scraps for that to use as die cuts, but it has the same look to it as holographic cardstock does. Before I start to assemble my card, I'm going to stamp my sentiment. Before I use my stamp set, I like to take a white eraser and remove any manufacturing residue off of the stamping surface of that stamp. By doing that, I can make sure that my stamp takes the ink just a little bit better. And anytime I use a stamp set, even if I'm only using one stamp, I do that to the entire set so that I know that the next time I go to use that set, it's already been done. I don't have to do it again. I'm using my Misty stamping tool just to make sure to get perfect positioning on my stamp. That way I can stamp it more than once if I need to. Because I'm doing some embossing here, I want to make sure that I have a nice crisp look to my sentiment before I add the embossing powder. So I'm using some Versamark ink to stamp on here, and I'm using some black cardstock. It's going to work perfectly over my dark background here, and my silver embossing powder is going to shine nicely on it. Once I have the embossing powder on there, I take the excess off and then I can heat emboss it. If by chance you have any particles of embossing powder sticking where you don't want them to, just take a soft brush and brush that off before you do your heat embossing. Then you can take a trimmer and can trim this down. This is the new guillotine trimmer from Spellbinders, and I absolutely love it. I've been using a guillotine trimmer for years and really love the fact that they work so easily and so well, and I don't have to change blades on them. This one here, the clear guard, it comes up at an angle, making it a little bit easier to grab some of those sentiments and some of those small pieces that are under there. I set that to the side and I can start assembling my card. The first thing I'm putting down is that background. Now, the cardstock did warp a little bit while it was drying. So when I glued it down, I did put a heavy jar with some glass beads in it to hold it down while it was drying. I also had an acrylic block on there to hold the entire surface down, but I wanted a little bit of weight on there to make sure that that background flattened out nicely as well as had good contact with my card base. Once that was totally dry, I can put the next layer on and then finally my third layer on. And it's really easy to pick and choose exactly how you want these die cuts laying over top of it by just turning them if you don't like the way the clouds are positioned while they're that way. Now I'm gluing everything down flat here. You could use foam adhesive to get even more dimension to it. I chose to do all my cards in this video just glued down flat because most of them have several different layers. They're going to have some dimension and some thickness to them already. And I didn't want to add too much to it by using some dimensional adhesive. But if you want a lot of dimension to it, you can absolutely get that extra dimension by adding that extra adhesive to it. I used some reverse tweezers to glue down my holographic stars, and then I'm going to add some crystal mix gems. This package has two choices in there. There's one that is more white, and then there's one that is a little bit more clear and has a bit of a holographic prism look to it. And those are the ones that I'm choosing for this. They're going to tie in really nicely with the stars, as well as the fact that they're going to be a little bit more subtle than the white ones. I'm using a die pick to pick them up and position them where I want to, and then just using my finger to press that into place. They already have adhesive on the back of them, and I found this is the easiest way to position them, is just using the die pick to kind of pick into that adhesive, lift them up, and then position them exactly where I want. Once you have your gems on there, we are good to go, and the card is completely done. And I love the sparkle you get from those gems. For the next card, I'm going to use the underwater tunnel die set, and I'm also using the underwater marine life die set. I'm just using several different colors of Spellbinders cardstock here. I have waterfall, teal topaz, and lagoon. I'm using the largest die on the waterfall here. Now, what I did for this particular card is my mats are a 1/4 inch smaller than the one below them. So I have my A2 card base with the darkest color, the lagoon. I have a mat that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 with the teal topaz, and of the waterfall, I have a mat that is 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So you can see the largest die just fits into place with that largest or that smallest mat there, but I wanted to have the look of the mats on the outside as well as the look of the different colors on the inside. To cut my second layer, I took my first layer, laid it over top, and then I positioned my dies so I can control exactly where that die cut is placed and how it's going to look. And I'm going to do the same thing with my third layer here. Once everything is, or once I have a position and I like where that die is, I'll tape it into place, put my other mats on top of it just to make sure that I like that look, and then I will die cut them. So it's a little bit different than the first card because I wanted to make sure to be able to see certain things. It's easy enough to die cut each one of these layers separately. Now there are 3 dies here and 3 different colors of cardstock. I didn't have a 4th shade that was going to go with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some distress ink and I'm going to color this die cut to be a darker shade to place in the center. So I get the look of 4 different colors, but I only have 3 colors. So that ink blending or that swatching that I did was on the back of the die cut just to see which one was going to give the look that I wanted. I started off with using Evergreen Bough, but it didn't darken it as much as I wanted to. So I ended up going over that with some pine needles and it gave the perfect effect. The Evergreen Bough was okay, like it wasn't bad. It was a little bit darker than the original color of cardstock, but I wanted it to be just a little bit darker. So that pine needles went perfect. I'm using a large ink blending tool here. It just covers it a little bit more quickly. You could use a regular one as well, and that would totally do it. So with that ink blending done, I'm just going to pop it into that hole, place my layers on top quickly just to make sure that I like the look of it, and I love how it darkened it, but it goes right within that same color palette. So I just put some glue on the back of it, popped it right into the hole of that card, and it looks like there's another layer of cardstock back there. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm also putting some acetate in between my other layers of my card. This is going to give the shine of the water, and it's also going to give my Marine Life die cuts something to stick to for the ones that I want to be kind of hovering in the center of the card. I'm using my Barely Art glue to glue that into place and place that acetate on, and then I'm putting an acrylic block on there to hold everything in place nice and flat while it's drying. And I'm leaving it drying with the glue side facing up so that I can see when it goes from white to clear. Once it's clear, it's dry. So by having that facing up, I can see when it's totally dry and I'm ready to move on to my next step. While I was waiting for that to dry, I did do some die cutting, and I die cut all of the pieces that I was going to need to carry carry on with the rest of the card. A lot of this Marine Life has different layers to it, and they're very, very easy to layer up. Most of them are just 2 layers, but it's really easy to know exactly where each piece goes to layer everything up and assemble them. Now the assembly for this particular card does take a little bit longer than a regular card because I'm positioning things with different levels or layers, and I want to make sure that what I want seen is seen. So I'll position things from my back layer and then put my front layers on top of it. You do need to assemble this from the back to the front. You don't want to start stuff on the front or if you start with stuff on the front, it's harder to position things behind there to make sure that it is seen. So by doing it from the back to the front, that was the way that I found it the easiest to layer everything together. And you can see I regularly go back and forth, put my front layers on it, making sure that I like the position that I have, and then I start to glue things together. The one thing to be careful of here is to make sure not to put glue on the back of the die cuts that are going over that opening, because you don't want to accidentally glue your card shut. I did find that I put glue where I didn't want it to go, and I just didn't press it down, so it worked out totally fine, but you do need to make sure to be very careful of that. After I have my anchor, my seaweed, and some coral in place, I did add a few rocks with the anchor. And then once I'm done that, I can start moving or putting things onto my second layer. So after that first layer is done, I can move things onto the second layer or put my front piece on just to make sure that I can see those die cuts through the openings. Now for this card, I did start with my seaweed and my coral on the bottom, and I'm layering all of those pieces first. And then afterwards, I will put the fish in the openings in the top. So I'm only concentrating on one thing at a time. This second piece of seaweed here, the light green one, I had it more to the side so I knew I was going to see it around or on the outside of my mats. And when I was assembling this, I liked it. After I assembled my card together, I wasn't sure if I liked it. I kept it as it was, but it's one of those things. It's personal preference. You may like it and you may not like it. So once again, with those second layers done, I can assemble my card here, put everything together just to see if I like where those layers are. Add other layers if I want them to be there. So these die cuts are done with several different colors of Spellbinders cardstock. The coral there is Dahlia cardstock. The light green for the turtle as well as the seaweed is Peridot. The dark green is fern. The yellow is saffron. And the orange that I have is persimmon. I wanted these fish to be nice and bright and vibrant, and since they appear to be more tropical fish anyways, it worked perfectly to make them more vibrant in color. And those pinks and oranges and yellows stand out perfectly over top of the teals of the water. So you can see how everything really comes together as you're laying it in place. And you can see how you really need to work kind of from the back to the front. It would be a lot more challenging to work from the front to the back, in my opinion. For this particular card, I just used vibrant cardstock. I didn't do any ink blending, but you could absolutely add more dimension with ink blending if you wanted. I kind of figured with all of the different layers, there was going to be a lot of texture and dimension anyways, and it didn't necessarily need that ink blending, but you could absolutely do it if that is your cup of tea. And usually it totally is mine. I just liked the look of these bright die cuts without the ink blending for this particular card. So off screen, I took one of the sentiments and I stamped it, and then I'm using my trimmer just to cut it down. I absolutely love the different sentiments in this set. Like I said before, there's a lot that work well or are custom for these different dies in this line, but there's a few different ones that are also just generic ones as well. So they're not all themed just for these dies. For the bubbles for the fish, I'm just using some glossy accents, adding little dots of different sizes, and then I'm going to let that completely dry. You could also use gems here if you wanted, but I love the look of the glossy accents bubbles. Once that is completely dry, the card can start being assembled, and I'm using that same Barely Art glue, putting it onto the back and positioning my acrylic block on top of that to hold everything in place. Now, like I said before, I created this one with layers on the outside, or mats on the outside as well. So you see mats around the outside as well as the different layers on the inside. If you didn't want to do that, you could completely eliminate that as well and not have that. I also think this die set would look really, really cute on a 4x6 picture or card. Picture. If you happen to have like underwater photos of your kids swimming or someone swimming, if you happen to know someone that loves scuba diving, I think it'd be fun to create different frames around that as well. Now, because I have that one little blob, the darker one on the center of my inside of my card, I thought it would be fun to add a few die cuts as well, just to kind of go through or go with that theme on the inside. It still leaves plenty of room on the outside in order to write a message, but I didn't think you would want to be writing on that center part anyways, because it is a little bit darker. But I love the unexpected little clump of seaweed and rocks there with that sentiment. It works perfectly. And even though that sentiment is over that center part, the turtle covers most of it. For my third card, I thought it would be fun to reuse the bits that were die cut out of the piece for the second card and use that as a sky behind my birds. Now, you could also use the dies from that second card in the similar way with the perched birds, and there's a sample of that on the front of the birds die set. But I thought it would be fun to reuse these pieces and use them as an interesting background. So I die cut all the pieces from the perched birds off screen, and I can just place them where I want to on the front of the card once I have those colored blobs, for lack of a better word, on there. I can start to position that. Now, these dies, you can see at the very, or die cuts at the very end, they have circles. Those are perfect for assembling the card similar to the way I did last. It gives you an area to glue those branches between the different layers so that they have anchor points between the different layers. You can also put leaves at the end of them. So for this particular card, at the end of the branches, I'm just going to cover those little circles with leaves. You're never going to know that they were there. And then the ones that go off the cards, I will cut it off once my card is assembled and has dried. While I'm waiting for the branches and the layers to dry on my card base, I'm going to assemble my birds together. And you can see that they're very easy to assemble together. And they're very generic looking birds, so you can have a lot of fun with the colors if you want. I chose to do Cosmic Sky for the background part of the bird, and then just some craft cardstock, and then some Dahlia cardstock for the wings as well as the tail. I made both birds the same colors, but you could easily use different colors to assemble them and have lots of fun with that. I'm not gluing my birds down quite yet because there's a couple of green branches there that I'm going to glue underneath them, but I do want to have my birds in place while I'm putting my leaves on the trees, just to make sure that I'm liking the look of the way things are going. To glue those leaves on, I'm just using my Barely Art glue with a fine tip, putting some glue on the ends of those branches, and then I'm using a jewel picker in order to pick those leaves and position them. It makes it so much easier to do this than to try to lift up those die cuts. They're really quite tiny, so it's hard to lift them. You can probably do it with some tweezers, but very difficult to do it with your fingers. So a jewel picker or some sort of picker tool makes it very, very easy. And the die for the leaves in this set also cuts all of those leaves all at one time. So it's very easy to do the die cutting. There's a couple extra leaves, so I'm going to do a couple of the leaves doubled up a little bit. And you could easily cut them a second time and have a whole bunch of extra leaves and do more doubling up of the leaves if you wanted them to look a little bit fuller. I chose to not do that so that I could see a lot of my colored background as well. So now I've got to glue on those sprigs. I'm doing one under each bird. When you do the dies from the set, there's 3 different sprigs. So the third one, I'm going to just tuck underneath that bottom branch. And I should have done this before my branch was totally dry, but I didn't think about it at the time. I thought I was just going to layer these pieces over top of the branch, and I ended up not liking the way that they looked. So my branch there is basically dried and glued down already. So I'm just using a die pick just to lift up the edge, just to tuck the end in a tiny little bit. It doesn't need to be tucked in a whole lot, but just a tiny little bit, just to hide that a little bit. I like the look of these branches as like kind of new growth, but because they're a different color than the craft color of the rest of the branches, they looked a little bit odd just laying on top of it. So while that is drying, I'm going to use one of my sentiments just to stamp onto some of the Dahlia cardstock. I used the walnut stain ink pad that I've used for a couple times, or used for a few things in this video. It ties in perfectly with the birds. Some of the sentiments that I did embossing, and some of them I just stamped on the background, and I love the look of both. And by using colored inks on the different colored cardstocks, it makes it very easy to match those sentiments with the die cuts. For a different look for this one, I just kind of did a flag end on it. So I just used my scissors to cut in and create or a flag end, ribbon end, and then I'm having it off to the side. I'm using some Smoky Topaz gems for this card. I thought they tied in well with the bird, so I'm going to scatter those around a little bit. The one thing I wanted to not do, though, is to put these beneath the birds, because I didn't want them to look like bird droppings. So I'm using the same technique as I did before to place them down. The gems come with 4 different sizes. For my Galaxy card, I only used the tiniest size because I wanted the stars to be tiny. For this one, I'm using a few of the different sizes to have a little bit of variety in that background. And when it comes to these, you can use as much or as little as you want. I wanted them scattered around a little bit just to fill in some of that space, but I also tried not to put too many. After I was done, I took a look at it and I thought it would be interesting to also use the glossy accents and add some clear dots in the background. It's just going to give a little bit more texture. It's going to add to those gems in the background, but it's not going to give any color. I didn't want to put too many gems and have kind of a spotted background. So this was the perfect solution. And by having that glossy accents in a bottle that has a nice fine tip to it, I can control exactly how much or how little I'm putting down. So once I have as many dots as I want on there, I can let this completely dry. And because those dots are really tiny, they don't take very long. I want to say it took maybe 15-20 minutes for it to completely dry, and then I can cut the ends of those branches off and my card was done. The last card I wanted to create was using the Rainbow Slice Tunnel, and this die set comes with so many different florals and foliage dies, but I had an idea to do kind of a shooting star with it. So I have some Indigo cardstock here that I'm using, and then I have a bunch of different metallics from the Sizzix Opulent cardstock pack. This one is in different silvers, and I love that you have a pack here that you can choose many different specialty cardstocks that go together very well. I'm going to die cut each one of these layers separately so that I can put the top layers over the bottom layers in order to position that die. I want to make sure that I have them all positioned correctly and to make sure that it lines up nicely. So this one here is like a silver glitter cardstock, and I also wanted to have my star cut out of this cardstock as well, because that solid part on the right is going to be underneath my Indigo cardstock and you're not going to see it. There's no reason why I can't die cut my star out of there. You're never going to know anything was die cut out of it, and much better to use that piece that is going to be covered than die cutting into a totally separate piece. So I'm going to work through these different layers here, positioning all of the pieces on top of each other while positioning my dies underneath. And then I tape those dies in place just to make sure they're not going to shift. Now, a couple of these, my die cut didn't quite reach the end of the cardstock, so I just tore it off while I was taking my die off, but I did use some scissors just to even that end out a little bit. And we're talking millimeters here. It's not a large area, but it's an easy way to extend the path of that shooting star or the rainbow slice tunnel depending on how you're creating it. Now this I think would also look really, really cool. There was a paintbrush die set that Spellbinders came out with a couple years ago. I think it would be really fun to use that paintbrush die set and kind of have the look of different paint colors coming off of it. I think that would be a fun look as well. I think there's so many different ways that you can use this die set to create many different looks. And using this die set with all of the different foliage that is in it, I can't wait to use it that way as well. That's totally my cup of tea, but I wanted to try something that was a little bit different, as well as the fact that I had this idea, this trail to me looked like a shooting star. I also think it would look really cool, kind of as the Northern Lights. So now that I have all of my layers here ready to go, I want to stamp a sentiment on that Indigo cardstock piece before I assemble the card together. That way, if by chance I make a mistake, I can just cut a new piece and redo it. So I put my cardstock in my MISTI here and put the magnet in place. I put some embossing powder tool on top of it just to make sure that my embossing was only, or my powder was only going to stick to the ink. This is a step that I should do way more often, but I often forget about it until I have my powder sticking where I don't want it to. Now that my sentiment is stamped in place, I'm just using some silver embossing powder, pouring it over top, putting the excess back in the container, and then I am heat embossing that sentiment. And once that powder is completely melted, I'll be ready to start assembling my card. I'll have all of the pieces ready to go. So when I'm assembling this, I'm going to assemble it from back to front to make sure that I have everything positioned properly. So for the back here, I could have just put a different color cardstock in there, but I thought I would reuse the piece that came out of that glitter cardstock for my first layer and just glue it into the opening of my last layer. That way I have another silver cardstock. There was enough that I could have used one of the other silvers in the cardstock, the Sizzix cardstock pack, but I really love the look of this glitter paper and thought it would look great in that center as well. So I'm going to work layering the different layers on top of the last, making sure to position everything so that corner matches perfectly. And you can see how easy it is once everything is cut and ready to go, how easy it is to glue those layers on. And I'm using that acrylic block on top of my layers while I'm putting glue on the next one. It just makes sure that everything stays nice and flat. And because we're working with specialty cardstocks here, the glue isn't going to grab quite as quickly as regular cardstock. So I want to make sure that everything is positioned and staying positioned properly while those things are drying, while I'm working on my next step. With my Indigo cardstock piece on there, I can glue down my star. And once those layers have dried enough, I can glue that onto the front of my card base. Now, I have a bunch of different layers on the back of this Indigo cardstock here. The Indigo card, or the specialty cardstocks, are a different size. They're 8 inches by 5.5 inches, or sorry, 11.5 inches. So when I cut them into quarters, I created a different or weird size. So I have a layer on the, or section on the top that doesn't have those layers beneath it. It doesn't affect the card at all. To create a little bit more dimension, I took the star die cut and I added some glossy accent on it. So I get that glossy look as well as the glitter look beneath it. And then I let that dry completely. And I absolutely love the look of this. It would also look fantastic in gold. This new Tunnelscapes collection from Spellbinders makes it so easy to create cards that have some layered dimension without doing a whole lot of thinking. The hardest one probably was the underwater one to create the different layers to it. And that was mostly because of the acetate in the center of it. You couldn't really tuck anything in because the acetate was in the way. But each one of the main dies of this collection has so many different ways that you can take it and different ways that you can use it. And I love that it has so much potential to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here and spending your time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.